It was a cold evening in New York City, and the wind blew softly around the corners of tall buildings. Inside the grand ballroom of the Hilton Royale Hotel, golden lights sparkled from crystal chandeliers. Waiters and waitresses moved quietly around the room, placing glasses, setting napkins, and checking everything twice. The night was special, a charity dinner hosted by a man named Richard Galloway. He was rich, well known in the business world, and had a reputation for being proud and arrogant. People came to his events not just to support causes, but also to be seen in the glow of his money and power. Among the many waiters was a young woman named Emily. She wore a plain black uniform with a white apron, and her brown hair was tied back in a neat bun. She looked quiet, calm, and polite. She didn't talk much to anyone, but her eyes noticed everything. She was always on time, always did her job, and never complained. Most guests didn't even look at the waiters, but Emily didn't mind. She wasn't there to be noticed. She was just trying to finish her long shift and go home to her small apartment where her little brother waited. That evening, Emily had been working since early morning. Her feet hurt, her back was tired, and she hadn't eaten properly all day. Still, she moved gracefully, carrying trays and smiling gently at the guests. She knew how important it was to be careful, especially at events like these. One broken glass or one spilled drink could cost her the job. She had taken extra shifts this week because her brother needed new shoes for school. The rent was due soon. Richard Galloway sat at the center of a large round table covered in expensive white cloth and golden plates. He wore a tailored black suit, shiny leather shoes, and a silver watch that sparkled under the lights. Around him sat other rich businessmen, their wives in designer dresses, and a few politicians trying to impress each other. Richard laughed loudly at his own jokes, talking about business deals, golf games, and travel. As Emily passed by his table with a tray of drinks, Richard's eyes followed her. Something about her quiet presence caught his attention, not in a kind way, but in a way that made him curious. He whispered something to the manager nearby, pointing at Emily. The manager walked up to her and said, "Mr. Galloway has requested that you serve only his table tonight." Emily blinked but nodded. "Yes, sir." She walked over to the table and quietly began serving water and wine. Richard watched her every move. He saw how she avoided eye contact, how she didn't speak unless spoken to, how she gently placed glasses without a sound. It gave him a strange kind of power. He enjoyed making people uncomfortable, especially those who couldn't talk back. For him, it was like a game. "So," Richard said suddenly, looking straight at Emily, "what's your name?" Emily hesitated, then softly said, "Emily, sir." "Emily," he repeated loudly, as if the name amused him. "That's a simple name for a simple girl." His friends chuckled. Emily forced a smile and looked down. "Tell me, Emily," he continued, "do you like working here?" "Yes, sir," she replied quietly. Richard raised an eyebrow. "Do you, or are you just saying that because you need the job?" Emily didn't answer right away. The guests laughed again. She just nodded politely and moved to refill a glass. Inside, she felt the sting of embarrassment, but she had faced worse. She told herself not to let it bother her. She needed this job. After some time, dinner was served. Soft classical music played from hidden speakers. People chatted, laughed, and drank expensive wine. Emily moved around the table unnoticed once again. But Richard wasn't done. He had an idea, a cruel one. He thought it was funny. There was a grand piano at the corner of the hall, shining under the lights, but untouched. A pianist was supposed to come, but he had canceled last minute due to illness. The piano sat there, looking useless. Richard suddenly stood up and clinked his glass with a spoon, catching everyone's attention. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said loudly, "this dinner is wonderful, but I think we need some real entertainment." People turned to him, curious. "Say," Richard continued, pointing toward Emily, "why don't we have some live music? Our lovely waitress Emily here looks like she could play us a tune." The room fell quiet. Emily froze in place, her heart beating fast. She looked around, unsure if he was joking. But Richard smiled widely and gestured toward the piano. "Come on, Emily. Impress us. Play something." Emily looked at the manager, hoping he would say no. But the manager gave her a slight nod. His eyes said it clearly, "Just go. Just do it and come back." Emily's legs felt heavy as she walked slowly toward the piano. She could feel everyone's eyes on her. Some people whispered. Others looked at her with amused smiles, expecting something silly. Maybe she would hit a few keys and run away. Maybe she would embarrass herself. That's what Richard wanted. Richard leaned back in his chair, smirking. He'd seen too many people try to act like they were more than they were. To him, Emily was just a poor girl in a black uniform, trying to survive. He thought he was being clever by pushing her into the spotlight, only to fail. But Emily sat down gently on the piano bench. Her fingers hovered above the keys. She didn't look at the crowd. Instead, she closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Something inside her heart opened a door she had closed years ago. No one knew who she really was. They didn't know that once. Not long ago, she had played piano every day. That she had been a child prodigy. She had been accepted into the most famous music school in the country. That her hands, though tired from carrying trays, still remembered every note she had ever learned. She touched the keys softly at first, like testing the waters of a frozen lake. Then, as her fingers found the rhythm, the music began to flow. It wasn't loud, but it was full of emotion. It was gentle, sad, and beautiful. It moved like a story of dreams, of silence, of hope and heartbreak. The melody climbed and dipped like waves. People stopped eating. Forks were placed down. Glasses were held in mid-air. No one had expected this. The arrogant laughs faded. The whispers stopped. Even Richard's smirk began to disappear. His eyes fixed on Emily's hands, which moved with confidence and grace. As if she had been born at that piano. Emily didn't look up. She didn't care who was watching. For the first time in years, she was lost in the music. She remembered her mother's smile, her childhood lessons, the competitions she used to win. She remembered the night everything changed, when her mother died and she had to quit school to care for her little brother. She had walked away from music thinking it was gone forever, but now it was here again, and it was speaking louder than any words she could say. When the last note echoed through the hall and faded into silence, Emily gently lifted her hands off the keys. She still didn't look up. She stood quietly, bowed her head slightly, and began to walk back toward her tray of drinks. For a moment, the room was silent. Then someone clapped, then another. Soon, the entire hall erupted in applause. People stood from their chairs clapping. Loudly, some even shouting, "Bravo!" and "Unbelievable!" Emily stopped in her tracks, surprised. She turned around slowly, and her eyes met the crowd. People who had seen her as just a waitress were now clapping for her like she was a star. And Richard, he sat there, frozen, his mouth slightly open. He didn't say a word. For the first time that evening, he was silent. Emily smiled softly, then turned back to her tray and picked up a glass. The applause still echoed behind her, but she returned to her work as if it was just another moment in her shift. But for everyone else in that room, something had changed. And for Richard Galloway, a man used to power and pride, something inside him had cracked. He had tried to humiliate her, but she had stunned them all. The applause had faded, but the feeling it left behind still hung in the air. Emily had gone back to her regular job, carrying drinks and collecting plates, as if nothing had happened. The guests continued their dinner, but their minds were somewhere else. Many kept glancing at her, whispering quietly. Some wore expressions of guilt, others of admiration. But the one who looked the most confused was Richard Galloway. He sat still, his face tense, as if something inside him had broken, and he didn't know how to fix it. Richard wasn't used to being surprised. He controlled rooms, owned conversations, and expected people to laugh at his jokes even when they weren't funny. He had built his world by standing on others, and no one had dared push back. But tonight, a quiet waitress with tired eyes and soft hands had destroyed that feeling of power in just a few minutes. He had wanted to humiliate her. He had wanted to see her fail. He had wanted people to laugh, to see her as nothing more than a poor server, pretending to be someone she wasn't. But instead, she became the star of the evening. Her music had been better than anything money could buy. She didn't need fancy clothes or a spotlight. She only needed her fingers and a piano. As Richard sat there, still staring at the empty piano bench, one of his guests leaned toward him and said, "She's incredible. You must be proud of discovering her." Richard forced a smile, but inside he felt small. Later, as dinner ended and guests began to leave, several people approached Emily. A woman in a red gown told her she had cried during the performance. A man offered her his business card and said he ran a music studio. Someone else asked if she gave private lessons. Emily smiled politely, thanked them all, but shook her head. She didn't give lessons. She wasn't a professional. She was just a waitress. That's what she kept telling herself. But something had shifted inside her too. That night, after cleaning up and punching out, she walked slowly through the cold streets, still wearing her uniform under her coat. The wind was cold, but she barely noticed it. Her mind replayed the notes she had played, how the keys had felt under her fingers, how the room had gone quiet when she began, how the applause had roared afterward. She hadn't felt that kind of peace in years. When she reached her apartment, she found her little brother asleep on the couch. His school books were spread on the table, and a half-eaten sandwich sat beside them. Emily covered him with a blanket and sat down, still thinking. There had been a time when music had been her whole life. She had dreamed of concert halls, of travel, of becoming someone people listened to. But that dream had ended the night her mother died. Her father had fallen into depression and couldn't work. Bills piled up. Emily had left school, picked up 2 jobs, and became a full-time caregiver at just 19. Music didn't pay rent, but waiting tables did. She had buried her old life so deep that even she had forgotten how it felt. But tonight, it had all come back. The next morning at the hotel, people were still talking about what happened. Even staff members who hadn't. Ben in the room had heard the story, so asked her to play again. The hotel manager called her into his office and, to her surprise, didn't scold her. Instead, he smiled and said, "Emily, I don't know where you learned to play like that. But last night, you were brilliant." Emily blushed. "Thank you, sir. I just played what I remembered." "Well," the manager said, "if you ever want to perform again, we'd be honored to give you the piano any time. Maybe on weekends?" The guests would love it. Emily politely refused. She didn't want attention. She didn't want pressure. Just wanted to work and go home. But the offer stayed in the back of her mind like a soft echo. Meanwhile, Richard couldn't stop thinking about her either, but for different reasons. His ego had taken a hit. He had tried to turn her into a joke, but now he was the one people were talking about. Some had even said he looked like a fool. That made his blood boil. Didn't like being laughed at. So, he made a decision. He returned to the hotel 2 nights later, this time with a different attitude. He asked to speak to Emily privately. The manager brought her into the side lounge, where Richard waited in a velvet chair, holding a glass of whiskey. When Emily walked in, he stood and offered a handshake. "Emily, please, sit." She sat slowly. She didn't trust him, but she stayed calm. "I wanted to apologize," Richard said, forcing a smile. "I didn't mean to embarrass you. It was just a bit of fun." Emily looked at him silently. Knew he had meant exactly to embarrass her. "You're very talented," he continued. "Truly, I have a lot of connections in the music world. I could help you, get you in touch with people, open some doors." Emily gave a polite nod, but said nothing. Richard tried again. "Look, I feel bad. Maybe I was rude. Let me make it up to you. I'd like to give you something." He pulled out a small envelope and slid it across the table. Inside was a check. $5,000. Emily stared at it for a second, then slowly pushed it back. "Thank you, Mr. Galloway, but I don't want your money." Richard's smile faded. "Why not?" "Because it's not a gift," she said softly. "It's guilt." For a moment, Richard was speechless. Then she stood. "Have a good night, sir." She walked out. Richard sat there, stunned. No one had ever turned down his money before. Felt something he hadn't felt in years. Shame. The next few days passed quickly. Emily returned to work as usual, but more people recognized her now. Some guests treated her with new respect. A few even asked if she was planning to release music. The attention made her nervous, but also curious. What if? What if she hadn't lost everything? One evening, an older man approached her during a shift. He wore a dark coat and a kind expression. He introduced himself as Professor Adler, a retired music teacher. Had been at the dinner that night and had recognized something in the way. She played "I taught at Juilliard for 30 years, he said. I've heard thousands of students, but very few have the touch you do. Emily didn't know what to say. I looked into you, he continued gently. I know you were accepted. There once, full scholarship. But then you vanished. Emily looked down. My mom died. My dad got sick. I had to take care of my brother. The old man nodded. Life isn't always fair, but talent like yours, it's a gift. It doesn't go away. You just hit it, and now it's found you again. Handed her his card. Come see me. I can help you find your way back. Emily took the card, but said nothing. That night she sat on the edge of her bed, holding it in her hands. Could she really return to that world? She still chased that dream? For so long, she had believed it was too late. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't. She looked over at her brother, asleep with his headphones on. She thought of her mother, of the old piano in their childhood home, of the dreams she had pushed away. The next morning, she called the number on the card, and her life began to change again. Emily stood outside the old music hall, her hands slightly shaken as she held the invitation. The air was cool, and the wind blew softly against her face, but the real chill came from her nerves. She hadn't stepped into a real music hall in years, not since her dreams were packed away with her mother's memories and her childhood piano. She had received the letter just a week ago. It was from Professor Adler. He had arranged a private session for hers, a few people, no pressure, no cameras. Just a grand piano, a quiet room, just in a chance. She almost didn't come. Every night since the charity dinner, Emily had replayed the scene in her mind. The spotlight, the piano, the silence, the music, and the applause. People had praised her. Some even begged her to perform again. But Emily wasn't sure she could do it twice. That night had felt like magic, like something had opened inside her and then quickly closed again. What if it didn't happen again? What if it had just been luck? But something deep inside her refused to stay silent. The part of her that once dreamed of music halls, of applause, of sharing her soul through the piano, that part had woken up. And now it whispered to her in every quiet moment, asking her not to let it die again. So, here she was. She pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped inside. The hall smelled like old wood and sheet music. It wasn't large or fancy like the Hilton Hotel, but it felt more real, more honest. She walked down the hallway and found Professor Adler waiting with a small smile. I'm glad you came, said kindly. Emily nodded. I almost didn't, he chuckled. That's how you know it matters. They walked together into the practice room. Inside stood a beautiful grand piano, polished and waiting. 3 other people sat quietly in the back. One was a music producer, another a piano teacher, and the last a woman who worked for a small record label. None of them looked intimidating. They were older, calm, and respectful. Emily took a deep breath, sat down at the piano, and closed her eyes. Her fingers found the keys like old friends. At first, she played softly, uncertain, like testing the water of a deep lake. But soon, the fear melted into the rhythm. The notes filled the room, smooth and emotional. She played without a plan, letting her heart guide her hands. It was not just music. It was a story, a confession, a dream wrapped in sound. The people in the room said nothing, but their eyes were wide. Professor Adler leaned back and smiled when she finished. The room was silent again. Then the woman from the record label stood up and said, "You're not just good, you're unforgettable." Emily blushed. She didn't know what to say. She wasn't used to praise. She wasn't used to being seen. After that day, things moved faster than she expected. The woman offered to help her record a small demo, just a few tracks, nothing big. Emily agreed, not because she wanted fame, but because she wanted to know what was still possible. She went to a small studio on her day off, played a few pieces, and left without much thought. But the recordings caught attention. People began sharing them online. A popular music blogger wrote about the mystery pianist Waitress with a heart-touching style. Soon, a local radio station picked up one of her songs, and a bigger music blog posted a video of her charity dinner performance, which had been secretly recorded by a guest. The video went viral. Within 2 weeks, Emily went from a quiet hotel waitress to a woman people wanted to know. Offers came in interviews, performances, collaborations, but Emily stayed careful. She turned down the flashy ones. She didn't want to be turned into a product. She just wanted to play. One afternoon, she returned to the hotel for her regular shift. The other waiters clapped when she walked in. Some guests asked for her autograph. The manager offered to give her permanent weekends off to focus on music. It was kind. Everything felt like a dream, but not everyone was happy. Richard Galloway had heard the news too. He had seen the video, read the articles, and watched the praise grow. And every time he saw her name, he remembered how it all began with him. Trying to humiliate her, people didn't laugh at her anymore. Now, they looked at him like a joke. He hadn't spoken to her since she rejected his money. He thought it was over. But now it was clear she had one. Without revenge, without shouting, she had made him look small just by being herself, and it bothered him. One evening, he returned to the Hilton for a meeting. He saw her serving drinks at another event. She looked peaceful, as if the world had finally given her space to breathe. He walked up to her, trying to look calm. "Emily," he said, "you've become quite the star." She turned and met his eyes. "I'm just doing what I love." He nodded slowly. "I suppose I should thank you for what?" "For showing me something I didn't expect." Emily looked at him closely. He wasn't smiling this time. He looked honest. "Judged you," he said quietly. "I wanted people to laugh at you, but they laughed at me instead, and I deserved it." Emily didn't reply. "I'm sorry," he added, his voice lower. "Truly." She gave a small nod. "Thank you." That was all. He turned and walked away. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was something close. A few days later, Emily was invited to perform at a small theater in the city. It was her first real concert. No waitressing. No uniforms. It's just her and the piano. She wore a simple white dress, her hair down, her fingers calm. The lights dimmed and the room fell silent. When she began to play, people leaned forward. Music filled the theater like sunlight through a window. She didn't need backup singers, flashy lights, or dramatic effects. Her soul was in her fingers, and that was enough. After the concert, people lined up to meet her. Some said she had healed something in them. Others asked where they could hear more. But Emily only smiled and thanked them. She didn't see herself as special. She just felt lucky to play again. Back at home, her brother watched her interview on TV. He smiled proudly. "That's my sister," he told his friends. "She used to play for me every night. Now she plays for the world." Emily sat beside him laughing. Not the world, just people who listen. But deep down, she knew this was just the beginning. Her story was no longer about failure. It was about finding her way back not just to the piano, but to herself. And the world was finally listening. The days passed quickly after Emily's first small concert, but her heart stayed full of the same feeling she had felt on stage piece. Pride and a strange warmth she hadn't known in years. She still worked part-time at the hotel, though. Her shifts were shorter now. The manager insisted she focus more on music and less on carrying heavy trays. But Emily didn't want to leave completely. That job had helped her survive. It had fed her and her little brother when no one else had been there. It reminded her where she came from. She didn't want to forget. Though she had started receiving invitations for more shows, radio interviews, even television appearances, Emily stayed cautious. She was not trying to become famous. She only wanted to share her music, play from the heart, and make people feel something. But slowly, the attention grew. People from across the country sent her messages. Some said her music had helped them during dark times. Others shared how she had inspired them to return to old dreams they had left behind. Still, many people didn't know the full story. They knew she had played piano at a charity dinner and stunned a room full of rich guests. But they didn't know why she had stopped playing in the first place, or why it had taken her so long to return. Even the kind music professor who had helped her didn't know everything. Emily had never told anyone the full truth, not even the people now offering her record deals and concert tours, until one day a young journalist named Rachel reached out to her for an interview. Rachel wasn't from a big news station. She worked for a small magazine focused on life stories and real people. When she contacted Emily, she didn't ask about fame or gossip. She asked, "Can you tell me about who you were before all this started?" That question stopped Emily in her tracks. She agreed to meet Rachel at a quiet cafe, far from the noisy city. They sat near a window, and Emily looked nervous at first. But Rachel didn't rush her. She simply listened. So Emily began to talk. She told her how she had started learning piano when she was 5 years old. Her mother had noticed her interest and borrowed money to buy a second-hand keyboard. Emily would sit for hours, teaching herself songs by ear. When her mother realized how serious she was, she found a local teacher to guide her. By age 9, Emily was performing in small concerts and winning school competitions. Music had become the most beautiful part of her life. She then shared how, at age 17, she was accepted into Juilliard, one of the most respected music schools in the world. Her family had been so proud. She moved to the city, ready to begin the life she had always dreamed of. But dreams, she said softly, can be very fragile. One winter evening, just before her second semester, Emily got a call that changed everything. Her mother had collapsed at work and passed away from a heart condition no one had known about. It was sudden, shocking, and cruel. Her father fell into depression. He stopped going to work, stopped speaking, stopped eating properly. Her younger brother, only 7 at the time, didn't understand what was happening. He cried every night. Emily tried to stay in school. She told herself she could manage. But her father's condition got worse. Her brother needed someone, and bills started piling up. Rent, electricity, groceries, it all became too much. She had no choice. "I left school and came back home," Emily said quietly. "I sold my keyboard, found 2 jobs, and started taking care of my family. Music wasn't going to feed us." Rachel didn't say anything for a moment. Her eyes were filled with quiet respect. "That's incredibly hard." Emily nodded. But I didn't regret it. I had to do it. She smiled faintly. "I thought I had locked that part of me away forever." Rachel wrote the story carefully and respectfully, sharing Emily's journey not just as a musician, but as a daughter and sister who gave up everything. When the article was published, it touched thousands of hearts. People from around the country, even the world, shared their own stories of sacrifice. Some had quit art school to take care of their siblings. Some had stopped writing or dancing or painting because life had been too hard. They saw themselves in Emily's story. That story didn't just bring her fans, it brought her supporters. One woman, a well-known music teacher from France, reached out and offered to sponsor Emily's training if she ever wanted to study again. A group of students from a music school in California sent her a handmade book filled with letters and drawings thanking her for reminding them never to give up on their gifts. And then something unexpected happened. An old friend from her Juilliard days saw the article and contacted her. His name was David. He had been her piano partner at school. Funny, kind, and always full of encouragement. Emily had lost touch with him after she left school, but now he sent her a message. "I always knew you'd come back," he wrote. They met again for coffee and talked for hours. David was now a piano teacher and sometimes performed at music festivals. He invited her to one of his upcoming concerts and asked if she'd like to perform with him. Emily felt nervous, but said yes. The concert was set in a peaceful open-air venue, with fairy lights hanging from the trees and a gentle breeze blowing across the stage. Emily and David practiced together for days. It was different than playing alone. She had to listen, respond, and move with him like dancing through music. The night of the performance, she stood backstage with her hands shaking, but David gently held her fingers and said, "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to be you." The music they played that night was warm and emotional, to people reconnecting not just with each other, but with the part of themselves they had once shared. The audience loved it. People laughed, cried, and stood up to clap by the end. But what mattered most to Emily was how she felt inside, free. After the concert, David introduced her to some musicians and teachers who wanted to work with her. They saw not just talent, but a soul behind the keys. Emily smiled humbly and listened, but deep down, she was still that girl who used to play on a secondhand keyboard in her mother's kitchen. One day, a man who had been in the audience approached her. He was tall, wore glasses, and looked familiar. He introduced himself as Mark, a former student of her mother. "I remember you as a little girl," he said. "You used to sit under the table while your mom gave piano lessons." Emily's heart jumped. "You knew my mom?" He nodded. "She used to tell us how proud she was of you. Every time you learned a new song, she made us all listen to your recordings." Tears came to Emily's eyes. She wanted the world to hear you, Mark. Said now, they finally are. That night, Emily went home and pulled out the old photo album her mother had kept. She looked at the pictures, her small hands on the keyboard, her first performance. Her mother smiling beside her. She realized then that everything had come full circle. She wasn't just playing for strangers or fans. She was playing for her mother, for the girl she used to be. And for every person who had ever believed they were too broken or too late to return to their dreams, she looked over at her younger brother. Now a teenager, doing homework on the couch. "Do you think Mom would be proud?" she asked softly. He looked up and smiled. She always was. Emily finally knew it wasn't just about talent or luck. It was about courage, and her courage had brought her back to life. It was early morning, and golden light spilled through Emily's bedroom window. She sat at her small wooden desk, holding a letter in her hand. The envelope was elegant, with gold edges and a royal-looking seal. Inside was an invitation one. That felt like a dream. It was from the New York Grand Symphony, one of the most respected music organizations in the world. They were inviting her to perform as a guest pianist at their annual charity gala. It was the same event where famous pianists and international musicians performed every year in front of thousands, including world leaders, celebrities, and powerful people. Emily stared at the paper in disbelief. She had never imagined something like this. Just a few months ago, she was a waitress, walking quietly between tables. Now, she was being asked to sit on the grandest stage and perform. In front of the most important crowd in the country, her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming feeling of everything finally coming together. The pain she had carried for so many years, the sacrifices she had made, the nights of crying alone. All of it had led her to this moment. She folded the letter gently and placed it back on the table. Then she looked out the window and smiled to herself. Later that evening, she told her younger brother. He was sitting on the couch playing a game on his phone when she said the words, "I've been invited to perform at the Grand Symphony Gala." He dropped the phone and stared at her with wide eyes. "No way. Are you serious?" Emily nodded. "It's real." He jumped up and hugged her tightly. "Mom would be so happy." Emily nodded, feeling tears form in her eyes. "I think she's already proud." In the days that followed, Emily began to prepare. She practiced for hours, carefully selecting which pieces to play. She wanted her performance to tell a story, not just of talent, but of heart, loss, struggle, and hope. She chose one original composition, one classical piece, and one soulful melody that reminded her of her mother. She practiced at night when the world was quiet, letting her emotions flow through her fingers like water through a stream. The day of the event arrived faster than she expected. Emily stood in front of her mirror, wearing a soft blue dress with a simple silver necklace. Nothing fancy, but elegant in its own way. Her hair was styled neatly, her hands freshly moisturized, her mind focused. But deep inside, her heart was beating fast. When she arrived at the grand concert hall, she was escorted inside by a kind assistant. The hall was breathtaking huge. Chandeliers, velvet red curtains, a polished black piano in the center of the stage under a spotlight. She walked toward it slowly, letting the space sink into her soul. Backstage, she could hear the sounds of people filling the audience, hundreds, maybe even thousands. She heard laughter, clinking glasses, soft conversations. Among them were critics, musicians, politicians, journalists, Sund, maybe even Richard Galloway. She didn't care if he came or not. This night wasn't about him anymore. It was about her. When the announcer finally called her name, the room quieted. A spotlight lit the stage. Emily stepped out with calm steps. Her dress shimmered softly under the lights. The audience looked at her with curiosity. Some recognized her face from the video that had gone viral. Others had read the story about the waitress who stunned a hotel ballroom with her piano. None of them knew what to expect now. She sat down on the bench, closed her eyes, and took a deep breath. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with anticipation. Then she began to play. The first piece was soft and dreamy, her own composition. It painted a picture of childhood full of wonder and gentle discovery. People leaned forward, drawn into the innocent magic of the melody. The second was a classical piece by Chopin, strong, emotional, and complex. Her fingers moved with precision and fire. Her passion burned through each note like sunlight through glass. The audience sat in awe. But it was the third piece that broke the room. It was slow and sad at first, then full of hope. It felt like a story of someone falling, losing everything, and then slowly rising again. It was her story told not through words but through keys and chords. It felt like walking through grief, then finding light again by the end of the final. Note, the hall was silent. Not a single sound. Then someone stood up and clapped. Another followed. Then the entire room rose in a standing ovation. Applause filled the air like thunder. Some people had tears in their eyes. Some couldn't stop, smiling. Emily stood, bowed gracefully, and let her eyes scan the crowd. In the third row, she saw Professor Adler smiling proudly. In the fifth row, David was clapping with both hands, tears in his eyes. And near the back, she saw her little brother, standing tall, beaming with joy, and just a few seats away from him. She saw Richard Galloway. He wasn't clapping. He was just standing there, staring at her almost in disbelief. Emily held his gaze for a second, then smiled softly, not out of revenge, not to make him feel small, but to remind him this was never about him. It was about her journey, her courage, her music. After the performance, she was invited backstage for interviews and congratulations. Famous musicians shook her hand. One composer said she played like she had lived 1,000 lifetimes. Another asked her to perform in Europe. Emily thanked them all with grace, but inside, she stayed grounded. She remembered the long days of serving coffee, the pain of watching her father fall into silence, the worry she had felt every night trying to keep the lights on. All those moments had made her strong. She didn't want to become a celebrity. She wanted to become a voice for people like Hirthos who had been silenced, forgotten, or pushed aside. In the weeks that followed, she received more invitations, some to perform, some to speak. One university asked her to talk about how music had helped her heal. She shared her story with students, reminding them that failure wasn't the end. Sometimes it was just the beginning of a better chapter. One of the most beautiful surprises came when the Hilton Hotel contacted her again. They had planned a special celebration in her honor. Staff members gathered in the ballroom, the same one where she had first stunned the crowd. They had decorated it with candles, flowers, and a large photo of her at the piano. The manager gave a short speech about how proud they were. Emily stood in front of them and thanked everyone. "I didn't grow here as a musician," she said. "I grew here as a person, and that's what made the music matter." Then she played a small piece for them, nothing grand, just something soft and warm. The staff clapped, and some wiped their eyes. Later, as she walked out of the hotel, she looked up at the sky. It was clear and full of stars. Her mother would have loved this night. Emily walked home, holding her bag with music sheets and her head high. She knew there would still be hard days ahead, but she no longer feared them. She had survived storms before. Now she had a new future one she had earned note by note. Her story had started in silence, but it ended in music. And this time, the world was listening.